Should Western troops be sent to Ukraine? Russia has warned it would hit back by striking British bases. This is World at War. I'm The Sun's defence editor, Jerome Starkey, and joining me today is former Armed Forces Minister James Heappey. James, thank you so much for coming in. You've been one of the people saying that Western troops, British troops, should be sent to Ukraine. Is that not going to spiral this conflict into a direct war with Russia?
No, I think no more than any of the previous steps forward that we've made in terms of our support for Ukraine. And look, fundamentally, this all starts with what's the theory of victory? And what is it that we're trying to achieve in order to deny Putin the claim of victory and to try to restore Ukrainian sovereignty? Putin started this whole thing by a wish to deny Ukraine its pathway towards EU and NATO membership. So it stands to reason to me that the sooner that we can accelerate that pathway, the EU thing's not in our gift anymore, but NATO is, the sooner we can accelerate the pathway, the better. And then in addition to that, to start seeing Western troops in the western part of Ukraine, normalising their presence in that part of the country. Probably most usefully as part of a training mission, because the Ukrainian army is now a big second echelon, as the generals say, kind of volunteer army, fighting heroically in very small teams. The race, Jerome, is to be able to get them to fight as brigades and as divisions in groups of 8,000 or 30,000. And if that is to happen, having trainers in the country who can train them at battle group, brigade and divisional level manoeuvre, rather than having to take huge numbers of people all the way out to Poland or Germany, then that feels like that's what's militarily necessary. Whilst at the strategic political level, having a donor community force in the west of the country just accelerates that momentum towards NATO membership.
But do you accept that if we put British soldiers in Western Ukraine, we are putting them in harm's way, and it is perhaps almost inevitable that British blood will be spilled as a result?
Well, look, I think we have to be very clear with Putin what it is that we are doing there. I think we have to be very clear with him about the consequences of attacking those bases. And then I think it's for Putin to make that calculation over the degree to which he wants to escalate. We are already training Ukrainians in vast numbers outside of Ukraine. I think that the argument is there that to do so in the west of Ukraine, so kind of west of Kyiv, would be great for the Ukrainians, but that's where we have to say to Russia, this is what we're going to do. You make your choice, live with the consequences. But over the last year or so, Putin, I think, has got used to thinking that he's re-established escalation dominance. Whereas I think in the first year of the war, Putin was really quite confounded by the way that the donor community went there first, and they went to, and we went to places that he didn't think we would go. And that brought with it all of the unease in Russia and that sort of moment of real fragility at the back end of the first year of the war. And I think we've got to put Putin and his regime under more pressure. They can't have it their own way.
But he and his regime have made these veiled and sometimes explicit nuclear threats. We saw in response to your comments and indeed to French President Macron, who was saying the same thing, Russia launching tactical nuclear drills across its southern forces. They've also said that they would strike British bases inside Ukraine. I think the Ministry of Defence would challenge or dispute the idea that we have any bases inside Ukraine and British bases outside. That is escalatory rhetoric. Do you take Russia at its word?
But at every turn, there has been that sort of rhetoric. There was that sort of rhetoric when we provided MLRS. There was that sort of rhetoric, actually, when we provided NLAW in the very first place. So it is in the Kremlin's playbook to seek to deter the donor community by trying to scare the donor community out of supporting Ukraine by threatening all sorts of violence and escalation, including the nuclear saber rattle. Now, we've got a choice. Are we going to be deterred by that rhetoric and therefore do what Russia wants, which is to plateau our support to Ukraine in such a way as best case, it maintains the stalemate, but may even, heaven forbid, see the Ukrainians pushed even further backwards? Or are we going to challenge ourselves to say that the donor community, the Western interest, remains this ending on Ukrainian terms with Putin visibly defeated? And if we're still seeking to achieve that strategic outcome, then we have to challenge ourselves about what is the next thing that we do to both deny him victory, bearing in mind that his initial war aim was to deny Ukraine the opportunity for a pathway towards EU and NATO membership. So by definition, being there and in parallel accelerating NATO membership denies him that initial war aim. But also it gives the Ukrainians a far better chance of tactical success, because our capacity to train them at brigade and divisional level so they're capable of the level of operation required to retake their lost territory, that's something I think you can only achieve in country.
So on a practical level, if you were in charge, you could have it your way, what would you see? How many troops? What sort of defences would they need to make this a reality?
So I think you would put sufficient troops to train brigade level manoeuvre into Western Ukraine.
What's that in a number?
I don't know. I would assume that would require something in the order of 500, I would imagine. And then there's sort of enablers and things like that. But also, I think what you've got to be clear on is, because you've got to, whilst you can't be deterred by the threats that the Kremlin makes, you've also got to be realistic that they may seek to honour them, and we owe it to our troops to try to protect them. So there's probably some sort of air defence bubble that we and or the donor community put around wherever that training is taking place in order to deny the Russians the opportunity to come good on their threats.
And above and beyond that, what does Ukraine, I mean, can Ukraine win this war? And what does it need in the next weeks and months to make that a more of a realistic possibility?
So it definitely can win the war. And people say, well, what does winning the war mean? And I think that's a matter for President Zelensky. I mean, fundamentally, this is about Ukrainian sovereignty. And if at some point in the future President Zelensky decides to do some sort of territorial deal, that's entirely in keeping with where we've been all along. But first and foremost, what mustn't be allowed to happen is Putin mustn't be allowed to set an example in this century that shows you can take a bite out of your neighbour and get away with it. So he must be seen to fail. And then, we support the Ukrainians in whatever military objective they set for themselves. People forget, I think, that Dunkirk to D-Day, and it's timely to be using that parallel, was 4 years. So the sort of the Hail Mary, the kind of the 90-yard last second pass that we threw in 2023 in order to get the Ukrainians onto that offensive last summer, it was possible that the conscript Russian army, ill-equipped, low morale, was brittle. It could have broken. It was possible that Hail Mary might have come off. It didn't happen. I think one of the problems with talking up that offensive last summer is that people thought that the ratios needed to successfully go on the offensive and the scale of the skill that is needed, the military skill to achieve an offensive of that scale, could be achieved in the 6 months between the autumn 22 and spring 23. Dunkirk to D-Day was 4 years. People, those who are your oldest listeners and viewers will remember, troops all across the south of England training for 18 months solidly for the Normandy campaign. That's the sort of timeline people have to have in their minds, that to get the Ukrainians properly onto the offensive is probably another 2 or 3 years of work. And that's both donating materiel and it's training them to manoeuvre at that scale.
James, thank you for joining me on World at War. I'm the